Under the faint silver glow of the midnight sky, the banks of the Drinimur River in New Guinea were alive with movement. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers crept forward, their boots sinking into the mud, every step deliberate, every breath measured. Tall reeds swayed gently, offering partial concealment, but doing little to dampen the muffled sounds of weary men navigating the treacherous terrain. Officers strained their ears for the faintest hint that the Americans might have spotted them. Soft, urgent whispers from sergeants carried along the line, orders to keep silent, to blend with the shadows. Among the ranks of Major Mori Toshikashi's 1st Battalion, 78th Infantry Regiment, fear was not their only companion. Hunger gnawed at their insides, sharper than any blade. For weeks, they had pushed through New Guinea's unforgiving swamps and dense rainforests, surviving on insects, roots, and whatever edible leaves they could find. Their supplies were gone, the thin lifeline to their rear had long since been severed. Yet, through endurance and unyielding discipline, they had reached this point. But could sheer willpower overcome the might of the American forces entrenched ahead? At the center of it all was the architect of this desperate gamble, Lieutenant General Hadazo Adachi, commander of the Japanese 18th Army. His forces had been cut off since the Allied leapfrog offensives of spring 1944 seized key points along New Guinea's northern coast. With their supply routes severed and no reinforcements coming, Adachi's 55,000 men had effectively been abandoned by Japan's high command. On April 22, 1944, U.S. forces landed simultaneously at Hollandia and Atape, bypassing heavily defended positions and striking where the Japanese were weakest. From his headquarters at WWII, Adachi considered his dwindling options. His troops were starving, plagued by disease, and stretched thin across hundreds of miles. A march westward through Allied-controlled territory to rejoin other Japanese forces would be suicidal. Staying put meant slow death that left only one choice: attack. Adachi believed that if his men could seize Atape's airfields, they could capture vital Allied supplies and perhaps turn the tide. But this was a plan rooted more in Bushido, the samurai code of honor and sacrifice, than in sound military calculation. Born in 1890 into a family with a proud military tradition, Adachi embodied the values of stoicism, self-sacrifice, and physical endurance from a young age. Commissioned as a lieutenant in 1910, he served with distinction in Manchuria and China during the 1930s, earning a reputation for bravery and for leading from the front. Scars from mortar shrapnel across his face, neck, and leg were testament to a career spent in the thick of combat. By 1943, Adachi was in New Guinea, facing the grim reality of a war that had turned against Japan. The port town of Buna had fallen after fierce fighting, leaving the Japanese forces in retreat, their supplies abandoned, and their wounded left behind. Reinforcements trying to reach him were mauled by Allied aircraft and warships, and in March 1943, the devastating Battle of the Bismarck Sea had destroyed much of the 51st Division before it could even land. The conditions in New Guinea were as deadly as the enemy. At nearly 500,000 square miles, the island's terrain was a nightmare. Vast swamps, thick jungles, and the towering Owen Stanley Range, whose snowy peaks defied the tropical latitude. Travel without boats or bridges was slow and exhausting. Even the lush vegetation was largely inedible, earning the island the grim nickname, the Green Desert, among Japanese troops. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases ravaged both sides. Weapons rusted in the humidity, wounds festered without hope of healing. Rain fell in unending sheets for months at a time, turning trails into rivers of mud. Sergeant Masatu Ura of the 79th Regiment recalled the misery vividly, weapons corroding, food spoiled, and soldiers collapsing from exhaustion. By late 1943, Allied control of the skies was absolute. American bombers had shattered Japan's 4th Air Army, and coastal supply runs were reduced to nighttime dashes by small patrol boats and barges hugging the shoreline. In September, the Allies landed near Finschhafen, forcing Adaki's battered units on yet another grueling retreat through the mountains to new positions at WWII and Madang. Tokyo's high command, recognizing the hopelessness of holding eastern New Guinea, shifted its defensive line far to the west, effectively leaving Adaki's 55,000 men stranded. The orders that did come were contradictory, demanding both the holding of coastal positions and a westward retreat toward Hollandia. Adaki, over 1,300 miles from Tokyo, was left to make decisions on the ground that defied headquarters' detached instructions. In early 1944, as Allied reconnaissance flights and small landing parties probed Japanese positions, Adaki made his choice. He would not sit and wait for the Americans to come. He would take the fight to them, no matter the cost. The stage was set for one of the most grueling and tragic campaigns of the Pacific War, the March on Atape. April 22, 1944, American forces stormed ashore near Hollandia and Atape, striking where Japanese defenses were weakest. It was a bold move, landing between the 18th Army in the east and the 2nd Area Army further west. For General Douglas MacArthur, the gamble was calculated. Allied code breakers were reading Japanese communications almost in real time, allowing him to anticipate Adaki's plans. In New Guinea, Adaki and his immediate superior, General Korechika Nami, were eager to confront the Americans head-on. Both believed that a decisive counterattack could shatter the enemy's hold on Atape and Hollandia, but Tokyo saw things differently. On May 2nd, Imperial General Headquarters issued fresh orders, another withdrawal, deeper into the Vogoka Peninsula. Once again, Anami passed the directive to Adaki, move west and defend. Then came the final blow to coordination. On May 27th, U.S. forces captured Biak, cutting all direct communication between Adaki and the 2nd Area Army. Less than a month later, Tokyo reassigned the 18th Army directly to Southern Army Command in Singapore. The message was clear. Adaki was on his own. His new orders were vague. Hold what you can. Fight as best you are able. For a man steeped in Bushido, such a directive was almost an insult. Adaki was a soldier who valued action over passivity. In May, he wrote words that revealed his resolve. We want to live, we desire honor. If we cannot have both, we should discard life and cling to honor. His decision was made. The 18th Army would attack Atape in one final, all-or-nothing effort. The plan was given the name Operation A. Reconnaissance parties moved out first, slipping through the jungle to study the American positions. The main body began its long march soon after. The 20th and 41st Divisions set out from WWII, threading their way westward through terrain as unforgiving as any in the Pacific. The distance from WWII to Atape was over 200 miles, a journey of weeks for troops already weakened by hunger and disease. The 51st Division, save for a single regiment, stayed behind as a rearguard to slow the Australian advance from the east. Around 3,000 wounded soldiers remained in hospitals, while thousands more who could still walk were assigned to carry food, ammunition, and even dismantled artillery pieces. In all, roughly 35,000 men were committed to the march. From the outset, disaster struck. On May 10th, a landing barge carrying Lieutenant General Shigeru Katajiri, commander of the 20th Division, hit an Allied sea mine off WWII's coast. Katajiri and his staff were killed instantly. Days later, an airstrike claimed 6 senior officers of the 41st Division. Leadership losses at such a critical time were devastating. The march itself became a trial of endurance and will. Adaki initially set a goal of 8 miles per day. Ambitious given the jungle, rivers, and mountains they had to cross. Within days, the pace slowed to half that. Rations were meager, less than 12 ounces of rice per day, with biscuits only every few days. Sago palm fronds were boiled into a bitter paste to stave off starvation. Salt, medicine, and other essentials were virtually non-existent. The rainy season struck with brutal force. It was endless, recalled one soldier of the 20th Division, describing night marches through waist-deep water, each man following the stumbling figure ahead like mud-coated phantoms. Along the trails, The bodies of fallen comrades lay where they had collapsed, some already reduced to skeletons. To the living, they seemed to whisper a grim guide. "Follow us. This is the way to Atape." Enemy aircraft ruled the skies by day, forcing the columns to move under the cover of darkness. At dawn, they would sink into the damp jungle to rest, swatting mosquitoes and dreaming of capturing the American food supplies they had been promised. Adaki himself endured the same hardships, hiding a painful hernia behind a mask of stoic calm. Unknown to him, his radio reports were a gift to the enemy. Each morning, Allied code breakers tracked his progress, mapping the location and pace of his columns. At Atape, Task Force Persecution, commanded by Major General William H. Gill of the U.S. 32nd Infantry Division, prepared to meet him. Gill positioned his main defenses around the Taji airstrips, 8 miles west of Atape, with a forward force along the Drinimer River. This advance screen, commanded by Brigadier General Clarence A. Martin, consisted of 3,500 riflemen supported by artillery, armor, patrol boats, and Australian Bristol Beaufighter aircraft. The first clash came on May 22nd, when elements of Adaki's 20th Division nearly trapped an American reconnaissance patrol near Newman Creek. In early June, Japanese infantry ambushed a U.S. battalion at Yakomo, 3 miles west of Newman, only to watch in frustration as landing craft spirited the surviving Americans away. By mid-June, Allied intelligence believed they had pinpointed the date of the Japanese attack, June 15th. When it passed without action, some officers began to think Adaki had turned back. But in the jungle east of the Drinimer, 20,000 Japanese combat troops were still gathering, driven by a single goal: to strike hard enough to break through and take the airfields. As the months passed, the Pacific theater became a relentless test of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. Both Japan and the Allies understood that every island, every naval skirmish, and every air raid could tip the balance of the war. By early 1943, the Japanese High Command realized that their early momentum had begun to fade. Supply lines stretched thin across vast distances, and the once unstoppable Imperial Navy now faced growing pressure from coordinated Allied counterattacks. The battles that followed would no longer be swift conquests, but grinding struggles where every mile of ocean was contested. On the Allied side, American commanders embraced an aggressive new approach: island hopping. This strategy aimed to bypass heavily fortified enemy positions, capturing strategically important islands to serve as forward bases for the next leap toward Japan. Instead of wasting resources on every enemy stronghold, the Allies would focus on cutting off Japanese garrisons and forcing them into isolation. In the skies, aerial supremacy became a decisive factor. Long-range bombers and carrier-based fighters delivered crippling blows to enemy infrastructure, while reconnaissance aircraft mapped out the defensive layouts of future targets. The sea lanes were no less dangerous. Submarine patrols prowled the waters, hunting supply convoys and warships alike. One of the most grueling campaigns of this phase was the struggle for the Solomon Islands. Jungle-covered, mosquito-ridden, and battered by constant rain, the terrain itself seemed as hostile as the enemy. The fighting on New Georgia, Vella Lavella, and Bougainville tested the endurance of every soldier and sailor involved. Victory came not in sudden bursts, but in relentless, exhausting engagements that gradually pushed Japanese forces back. At the same time, the Central Pacific Front saw the U.S. Navy striking at the Gilbert and Marshall Islands. Here, the lessons learned from earlier battles paid off. Precision bombardments, coordinated landings, and overwhelming naval gunfire cleared the way for amphibious assaults. The result was a series of hard-fought but increasingly successful operations, each one bringing the Allies closer to the Japanese homeland. For the men on the front lines, however, these victories came at a steep cost. The heat, disease, and constant threat of enemy fire wore down even the most seasoned veterans. Ships sailed for weeks without seeing safe harbor, and air crews faced grueling missions with little margin for error. Yet, amidst the hardship, Morale began to shift. For the first time since the war began, many Allied servicemen felt the tide truly turning in their favor. Radio broadcasts spoke of victories, families back home received news of progress, and the grim shadow of early defeats began to fade. But Japan was far from beaten. Their military leaders, steeped in a code that valued honor above life itself, prepared for a defense that would grow ever more desperate. They fortified islands, constructed hidden bunkers, and trained their pilots for missions that defied conventional warfare. The war was entering a darker, more brutal phase, one that would demand even greater sacrifices before the end could be seen. By 1944, the conflict in the Pacific had transformed into a relentless advance toward the Japanese homeland. The Allies, now confident in their strategy and bolstered by industrial might, pressed forward across the ocean with precision and determination. Every new landing brought them closer to the heart of the enemy's empire. The next great leap came with the Marianas Campaign. The islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were not only vital stepping stones, but also key to launching strategic bombing raids against Japan itself. The Japanese understood this and resisted fiercely. Naval battles raged in the surrounding seas, culminating in the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where U.S. carrier base pilots destroyed hundreds of Japanese aircraft in a single engagement. It was a devastating blow to Japan's air power, one from which they would never fully recover. On the ground, the fighting was equally intense. The rugged terrain and fortified positions turned each island into a deadly maze. Civilians, caught in the chaos, suffered terrible losses, with many influenced by propaganda to believe they faced certain death at Allied hands. The tragedy of civilian suicides on Saipan became one of the war's most haunting chapters. From these hard-won victories, new opportunities emerged. The U.S. could now deploy its B-29 Superfortress bombers directly against Japan's industrial centers. Entire cities became targets as the air war shifted to a campaign of massive destruction aimed at crippling Japan's capacity to fight. Meanwhile, in the south, the Allies pushed through New Guinea and advanced toward the Philippines. For General Douglas MacArthur, the return to the Philippines was more than a military objective, it was a promise fulfilled. The battles for Leyte Gulf and the surrounding islands marked some of the largest and most complex operations of the Pacific War. Naval forces clashed in what remains one of the greatest sea battles in history, with carriers, battleships, and submarines all playing decisive roles. It was here that Japan introduced one of its most desperate and shocking tactics, the kamikaze. Pilots willingly turned their aircraft into weapons, diving them into Allied ships in suicidal attacks. While these missions caused significant damage and loss of life, they also signaled the deepening desperation of Japan's war effort. Each Allied victory came at great human cost, but the strategic momentum was now unstoppable. Japan's outer defenses crumbled, its navy was shattered, and its skies grew increasingly hostile to its own pilots. Still, the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands promised to be a bloodier, more brutal challenge than any before. The war's final chapter was approaching, but no one could predict just how it would end, or the terrible new weapon that would soon change the world forever.